Hello, my name is Dr. Leonard Horowitz, and this is my audio affidavit. And I swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help me God. My hand is on the Bible, and this is a presentation of the criminal acts and racketeering enterprise of Hawaii attorney Paul J Sulla Jr., or how to steal $1 million property for $10. This is an investigation and report that I conducted with Sherry Kane, an investigative journalist. And it is produced and narrated by myself in service to the community, the nation, and the FBI as a citizen's participation in government. I and Ms. Kane are victims of foreclosure fraud and organized crime, and this presentation is for the Federal Bureau of Investigation, the FBI, Kona Division for the Big Island of Hawaii. And this matter deals with the prohibited activities under 18 U.S.C. 1962, which is the anti-racketeering laws. And my affidavit today is presented in respect to 18 U.S.C. Section 4, misprision of felony, and it's also authorized by 42 U.S.C. 1988, the Private Attorney General Act, as I choose now to be acting as a private attorney general to bring this criminal operation to justice. This also deals with Hawaii Revised Statute 703-303, which is the execution of public duty, and it is my duty, as well as yours, whoever is listening to this, to advance the truth, ultimately, that could prevent others, such as myself and Ms. Kane, from being likewise harmed. The laws broken by Mr. Paul J. Sulla Jr. of Hilo, Hawaii include the following 8. U.S. Code 1962, as I mentioned, for racketeering and organized crime prohibitions. The Sherman Antitrust Act and the Clayton Act, which prohibits unfair competition in interstate trade. The Uniform Securities Act, or HRS 485A and 508, dealing with criminal penalties for the activities of Mr. Sulla and Company. The Uniform Fraudulent Transfer Act, as you'll learn about here, and you'll see the evidence on the graphics displayed perfectly well. Prima facie, right in your face, here's what he did, and it's clearly a fraudulent transfers. In fact, it's a series of fraudulent transfers to steal our property. 15 U.S. Code Section 1692, which deals with the unconscionable collection of false debt that Mr. Sulla has contrived to claim that we still owe him money, or allegedly his client's money. The titles, various titles dealing with conspiracy to extort by mail fraud, malicious prosecutions, and theft, fictitious, as I just mentioned, obligations, claiming that we owe money that we don't owe. And what you'll see is a number of forgeries that Mr. Sulla has filed, has certified, and we believe that he actually committed himself based on some handwriting analysis that not simply we have done, but we have hired an expert handwriting analyst, Beth Chrisman from California, to go over these and give us her conclusion as to who it was that did the forgeries, as you'll see. We're also dealing with the Uniform Controlled Substances Act violations by Mr. Sulla in the manufacturing of DMT, as we'll go into, which is a hallucinogenic drug. It's a Schedule I narcotic hallucinogen that Mr. Sulla not only manufactures on his property with his son and church workers, they call them church workers, but also distributes and traffics through some real estate agencies and agents that we're going to be showing you who they are and what they're about today. Foreclosure sale by mock auction that Mr. Sulla committed with complicit parties, and you'll read about that, and it's a violation of HRS 531-29. This is a picture of the beautiful property. On the left-hand side of your screen, you can see this is the property that we purchased back in 2004, and the property on the right is pretty much done by the end of 2006. My hard labor and personal investment went into this. A lot of money went into this, literally to teach the world better ways of healing, natural healing. And this property is magnificent. It's very unique. It has Hawaii's only lava-heated steam saunas and geothermally warm pools. The picture on your right is one of those geothermally warmed bathing pools. This image now shows you who these criminals and con artists are, these people who are complicit in organized crime with Mr. Sulla. You can see next to Mr. Sulla on the upper left-hand side of the screen, Jason Hester. he plays a major role as a shill, as a straw man, as a front man for Mr. Sulla. Loki White is between the two. That's Mr. Sulla's secretary, and the fellow below Mr. Sulla, the lower left-hand side of your screen, is the substitute for Mr. Sulla, who's been disqualified by federal court judges. His name is Stephen Whitaker, and the last time I was in court with Mr. Whitaker and Ms. Kane, he had claimed that Loki White, between Mr. Sulla and Mr. Hester, was his secretary when in fact he lied to the court. That is Mr. Sulla's secretary. To the right of Mr. Sulla was one of my previous attorneys named Gary Zamber, Gary Zamber, when I was working with him and believed in him as my attorney, did not tell me that he held a partnership, maintained a large real estate partnership with Mr. Sulla, and he's part of Mr. Sulla, in my opinion, based on the evidence, a crime syndicate in BZ Business Development that Mr. Sulla created and Mr. Zamber administers according to government records. To the right of Mr. Zamber is looking at Mr. Sulla, Mr. Augustus Elliott, who is a real estate agent, and Mr. Elliott runs Hamakua Coast Realty Group, and according to affidavits and testimonies that we have from people who have been victimized, or certainly concerned for the community, Mr. Augustus Elliott has trafficked some of the drugs that are being produced by Mr. Sulla. And the fellow lower right of Mr. Elliott is Paul J. Sulla III, and that's Mr. Sulla's son, who operates the church itself. Above Mr. Sulla III, you see, is Mr. Forrest Arnold from the Hawaii Green Realty organization, and Mr. Arnold goes on the internet and promotes exactly what it is that Mr. Sulla and the Sullas are engaged in. That is seminars to advance supposedly community medicine, community health, to happiness. If you're a person who's searching for God, the Mankind organization and the warrior training programs are being heavily promoted. And if you go and do a search like we have done on the internet, these groups very often engage in the ayahuasca journeying, taking the drugs. And so this is the market. And so Mr. Elliott and Mr. Sulla there are two of the people who are engaged in trafficking the ayahuasca being produced in the Sulla's church, they call it. Below on the lower left, in kind of a mug shot, which is exactly his mug shot, is Michael Sakel. He's a drug felon, arrested for marijuana. All of these folks are virtually engaged in promotions of marijuana for religious reasons. And, that's fine for most of us. You can do whatever you want with your body so long as you're not harming the community. And you can practice whatever religion that you want so long as your religion isn't causing harm to other people's lives or even religions. So you have respect. But the fact of the matter is that these people have zero respect. In fact, they were heavily involved with Mr. Sulla in commercially libeling and engaged in antitrust violations, in attempting to put yours truly out of business, to defame me and defame my companies. It's called commercial libel. Copyright violations included. We have trademarks that were violated by these people. And the three women that you see to the right of Mr. Sakel on your screen, one is Roxanne Joan Hampton, the other is Tiffany Edwards Hunt, and the third is Cheryl Sultan, whose stage name or alias is Sativa Jones. And these women were engaged in a Class C felony of producing a film that was taken by the folks on the right of them. As you see, there's a Dr. Alma C. Ott in a smaller image, Anthony Hilder, and others who are on the mainland. These folks took the video, revenge pornography video, of Miss Kane virtually in the nude, and they used this video to defame yours truly and to literally libel us, smear us, disparage us, ruin our business relationships, ruin our corporations, and they did a very, very good job at doing that. In summary of the facts with regard to this presentation, on January 15, 2004, convicted marijuana trafficker who we purchased this property from, Cecil Lauren Lee, he defrauded me. in the sale of what was an inn, a beautiful place that I just showed you a picture of. That moment of the sale, I didn't even realize that this man was actually fraudulently transferring this property to me and to the Royal Bloodline of David, my ministry, to evade judgment creditors, Philip Mays and Didier Flement, who Mr. Lee had previously defrauded with the same property, and virtually lying and not even telling them, like he never told me in his seller's disclosure, that the property had been seized by the federal government of the United States for Mr. Lee's harvesting and growth of 330 marijuana plants on this property. On June 15, 2005, Lee committed a forgery to bring about a judicial foreclosure against me. Mortgaged $350,000. He took back. The property was $550,000 property that we purchased. Gave him $200,000 down. And after the jury trial, in fact, the jury awarded me $200,000 in damages. The judge ordered me to make my final balloon payment, which I did on February 27th, 2009, taking, of course, into consideration the fact that this whole thing was outrageous. We had already lost about $1.5 million. The $200,000 jury award that we were given was basically a drop in the bucket for all the damages. We had $125,000 to $150,000 already in attorney's fees and cost also. And so when it came time to pay the balloon payment, well, we applied the jury award to that balloon payment, and that is where Mr. Sulla, to this very day, does not want to recognize that the entire mortgage was completely fraudulent. It was void. The notes were void by the fraud in the sale of the property, and ultimately he committed, as you'll see in a couple minutes, a non-judicial foreclosure. After the judicial foreclosure, denied the foreclosure because of a massive amount of equity that we held in the property, as we showed you already a picture of, but also the fact that we had paid timely, over 5 years, 60 months payment, all on time. And so we ended up paying an additional $154,000 plus in a final balloon payment on February 27, 2009, and took into also account this $200,000 jury award, which held at that particular time. On January 9, 2009, the Ibarra court ruled that it lacked further jurisdiction concerning any payoffs of debts. So, as I just mentioned, the February 27, 2009 payment came about 2 months after the Ibarra court said, it's over, folks. You can basically go ahead and do whatever you want to do with this payoff, because I no longer, after the first final judgment, I no longer have jurisdiction. So we took that to mean that we needed to pay it off and get on with our lives. March through May 2009, suddenly everything changed. Sulla appeared on the scene. He evaded multiple notices for final accounting and the release of the mortgage. Then on May 15, 2009, Sulla directed Lee to form a so-called church to assign my mortgage and my notes that, as I mentioned, I've already paid off, into this new church, fraudulently transferring therein $375,000 of false debt. Now, mind you, the church had not yet legally been formed. It didn't legally exist as a corporation at the moment of the assignments. So those transfers were fraudulent, and the entire action and transaction is null and void. But that doesn't stop Mr. Sulla from maliciously prosecuting me in attempted property theft. And he has been successful at stealing the property title. On June 27, 2009, Lee died, leaving no will, and exclusively Mr. Sulla in charge of whatever was left of his completely bankrupt estate. At this point, he owed his judgment creditors approximately $425,000, and Mr. Sulla was the attorney fiduciary who came into this to evade the probate matters, the probate court. Typical transactions when someone dies, Mr. Sulla came in on apparently a contingency agreement with Mr. Lee that was simply contingent upon stealing our property or getting whatever he could by hook or by crook from Dr. Leonard Horowitz. On August 31st, 2009, Sulla substituted the sham church for Mr. Lee as the plaintiff in civil number 0510196. That was the judicial foreclosure action. And Mr. Sulla has been since fraudulently concealing his own conflicting interests in this property and his contingency contract with Mr. Lee. In November 2009 through the present, Mr. Sulla knowingly has neglected all of my payments, all of the claims that we make, the counterclaims of all the damage that he's done, and he's claiming that we still owe $375,000. It's a virtual extortion, and it's abusing process and the courts as an extortionate weapon to maliciously prosecute me to pay money that I don't owe, and Mr. Sulla knows it. December 11, 2009, the defrauded court vacated the $200,000 jury award and substituted the church as the plaintiff, even though, as we'll see in a couple minutes, the church is completely fraudulent. And if I didn't pay, he threatened to foreclose again, non-judicially this time. And on March 19, 2010, after I refused to be extorted in this way, realizing the crime that was ongoing, and we had reported him to the police a number of times by this point, Mr. Sulla fraudulently mailed me a notice of his intent to foreclose, supposedly according to 6675. That is the Hawaii statute that requires strict provisions and accommodations required for a proper non-judicial foreclosure, which Sulla failed to do because at that moment in time, he had no clue whether or not we owed any money. In fact, that $200,000 at that time was still in the appeals court. We were still appealing that vacating of the award done by the defrauded Ibarra court. He was clueless about whether there was any money actually owed and what the amount owed was. At any rate, on April 20th, 2010, that was selected by Mr. Sulla as a tongue-in-cheek gag because that's Marijuana Day. 420 is the code for marijuana. So on Marijuana Day 2010, Mr. Sulla non-judicially foreclosed at an auction in front of the State Judiciary Building with Mr. Hester by his side, and also his notary by his side, who's also his secretary, who's involved in a lot of the criminal activities that Mr. Sulla engages in, and her name is Gloria Emery. On May 3rd, 2010, after the foreclosure, the non-judicial fraudulent foreclosure, Mr. Sulla fraudulently transferred the title from yours truly and the royal bloodline of David from his fake church to his fake church, with Hester operating and acting as the overseer. On June 9th, 2011, Sulla issued Hester a mortgage loan for $50,000 that's secured by my property. And at the same time, he fraudulently transfers the title from the church to Hester, enabling Sulla then to flip the property to himself for Hester's planned failure to pay taxes, which went in breach of his loan contract with Mr. Sulla. In other words, Mr. Sulla set it up knowing that Mr. Hester couldn't afford to pay about $5,000 a year in taxes. He's a pauper, he's a drifter, and he lives in a shack in the woods, has no employee, and Mr. Sulla knows this judgment-proof supposed overseer of this fake church would not be in harm's way. He uses him as a front man for this scheme and this crime, and that's why it is that now Mr. Sulla gives him a loan, which enables Mr. Sulla to foreclose again at any minute, this time on Mr. Hester for failure to pay taxes. On March 14th, 2012, Mr. Sulla filed with the Strands Court to make Mr. Hester the personal representative of Lee so that somehow he could legitimize what occurred retroactively. At any rate, it failed to comply with the laws requiring notice of siblings. On January 4th, 2013, in the Strands Court, I had Mr. Sulla sworn and on the witness stand, and asked him about his drug church and his relationship to the illegal trafficking of ayahuasca or DMT. And he pled the fifth, meaning that he basically refused to answer the questions, which in a court of law, it causes the court then to see this as what's called a negative averment. That is when the court then looks very speciously upon whatever it is that the witness is testifying to. On September 20th, 2013, Sulla trespassed to terrorize us here on this beautiful property. He forged a process service signature. He called it R-Dum. It's actually R-Dum. You can see that written here on the eviction warrants. These are securities instruments, a warrant for their eviction on their property. That's a security, actually, by legal definition, and it's a warrant. And that's securities fraud, and particularly in this case, it's a double felony because it's a forgery. And Mr. Sulla used Attorney Carey's stationery, and we have Mr. Carey actually stating that Mr. Sulla had forged one of his signatures on a legal filing that we caught him in doing. Mr. Carey, in fact, admitted that he had not signed that, and Mr. Sulla had signed it with Carey's name. You'll see in a couple minutes, Mr. Sulla is a repeat forger of a variety of people's signatures, as you'll see in a minute. Mr. Sulla was disqualified by federal judges in this case as a necessary witness at trial, and for being a concealed surety and responsible for all of the above torts and crimes that I've just mentioned. Mr. Sulla pays currently attorney Stephen Whitaker to carry on his fraud, and Mr. Whitaker shows up at court, as he did the other day, with a fake Jason Hester. Yes, that's right. They dressed up a man who looks a little bit like Jason Hester. They made him look like Jason Hester. They brought him in with a fake family to claim to the court that I was hurting Mr. Hester and his family. And this is a real criminal, organized crime, white-collar scheme that is outrageous. You can't even imagine that it goes on and that these attorneys are complicit in this organized crime. And as we mentioned, Mr. Sulla and Mr. Whitaker lied about Loki White, who is sitting next to him. He told the court that this was his secretary, when in fact it was Mr. Sulla's secretary, and that in fact Mr. Sulla is paying Mr. Whitaker because Mr. Hester is dead broke. He's a pauper and allegedly be able to pay, if he can't pay his taxes, never paid 1 cent of his taxes since 2010, when he declared that he was the new owner of the property. He let the tax bill go up to about $18,000. And how, if he owes all that money, can he pay 2 lawyers, Mr. Sulla and Mr. Whitaker? Obviously, Mr. Sulla is the exclusive real party of interest. He's the indispensable party. And when you study Hawaii law, Third Circuit actually requires, and it's a violation of the rules of the Circuit Court of Hawaii, 26B, which says that you have to get the court's permission if you're an attorney surety before you can plead before the court. So it's actually Mr. Sulla that pays Mr. Whitaker. In other words, Mr. Whitaker is a concealed surety collection agent for allegedly the fake church of Mr. Hester, and works actually for Mr. Sulla, who is likewise a concealed co-surety. Now this on your screen, what you're looking at now, is an organizational chart detailing the real estate enterprise of Mr. Sulla, and it's vast. Mr. Sulla owns more than 50 properties. They were brought to market, sold, or transferred within this array of enterprise entities. On the upper left, you have the major property manager that Mr. Sulla put together, Heahea Heights, LLC, and underneath Heahea Heights, you can see better than a half dozen different entities that deal with mostly real estate investments and corporations, wherein Mr. Sulla had a lot of money to invest. Now, again, where did that money come from? Not just his law practice. It appears Mr. Sulla and people that I've mentioned already, W. Augustus Elliott and others, run the Eclectic Center of Universal Flowing Light, Paulo Roberto Silva e Souza. That's a filing by Mr. Sulla of this supposedly non-profit corporation sole entity, just like he created for Mr. Hester. He created it for himself, and the sham Gospel of Believers Corporation that you can see on the lower right of the screen is the entity that stole our property title and attempted theft of our property, that has maliciously prosecuted us since 2009, when Mr. Sulla substituted the Gospel of Believers Corporation and Mr. Hester as the new plaintiff in our case. And you can also see above, it's called the Sky of Hawaii. In fact, brilliant research by Sherry Kane was able to uncover their website, which is only available to members. You have to know where it is, and now we know where it is, and so we can tell people, including the FBI here. And moving on to the upper right-hand side of this graphic, you can see complicit process servers, Robert Ducat and Kelly Tamikyong, who participated with Mr. Sulla and actually gave the court an affidavit fraudulently claiming that it was Robert Ducat's signature on the terrorizing set of service of warranties for eviction and ejectment from the property that frightened us and members of our community here. Pyramid Process Service is the main service for Mr. Sulla. They're part of his racketeering organization, and Mr. Ducat covers up for Mr. Sulla, as he grossly did in our case. And then in the upper right, you've got the foreclosure fraud enterprises. You've got Franco Services that were indicted, and Edna Franco convicted of defrauding clients that she used to work and partnered with Mr. Sulla in a forensic mortgage type of scheme and scam whereby she would refer clients who were down and out, losing their homes to the foreclosure fraud that was rampant in America a few years ago. Mr. Sulla and Keone Agard were partnered at the time, or for a short time, according to Ms. Franco's statements to us, and we recorded those. We have emails from her before she was indicted and convicted. At any rate, she now believes that Mr. Sulla is a huge con artist, and we have received many communications from Ms. Franco, who found the mortgage that Mr. Sulla had given to Mr. Hester and then sent that on to us, saying she was sorry for the bad blood, ultimately that she was hoping that this might help us in our case against Mr. Sulla. And this now is an image of the actual so-called church, Mr. Sulla's ayahuasca manufacturing property, located at 464070 Kahana Drive in Honoka'a, Hawaii. And this is the place where Mr. Sulla III, his son, act as supposedly head priests and shamans conducting ayahuasca ceremonies. And we know this to be certain. We have about a half a dozen affidavits from various people, including the fellow on the lower right of your screen, Mr. Michael Sakel, who worked in the church itself, manufacturing ayahuasca, delivering bottles of it packaged up in boxes to trucks that would take it then, according to Mr. Sakel, to the Hilo airport and then send it off to the mainland, where it would be bringing a lot of money. We also have testimony that Mr. Elliott, who you see in the upper right-hand side of your screen, this W. Augustus Elliott in the middle part of the upper right-hand side of your screen, he also traffics the ayahuasca through his real estate agency. Now here is a graphic of Mr. Sulla III, who directs the church, the chief priest or shaman, along with Sulla Jr., the attorney who owns the property. Supposedly, the latest word is that Mr. Sulla Jr., the attorney, was excommunicated from his own church. That's a laugh. We heard that the other day from Roger Christie, who was incarcerated. Mr. Sulla is apparently good friends with Mr. Christie, who went to jail for several years as being the leading marijuana religious rights activist in the United States. He's just gotten out of prison, and we were informed by Mr. Christie that Mr. Sulla Jr., the attorney, has been excommunicated from the church. He should be. But anyway, Mr. Sulla III, the son of Sulla attorney, is here pictured, and he now advertises himself legally as a certified marriage and family therapist. Previous to this, he had been for years illegally advertising himself, and we have the documentation to prove that. Now, Mr. Sulla's history and his related bio is pretty hideous. He was publicly censured by the Supreme Court of Hawaii in 2003, coming out of the case of Takaba versus the Commissioner of Internal Revenue, wherein he recklessly pled on behalf of Mr. Takaba. They fined Mr. Sulla over $10,000 for arguing like a reckless man. And then you had also United States versus Bruce Robert Travis, where the Ninth Circuit Court determined that Mr. Sulla had been complicit in the filing of false tax returns. At least one of them was all done by Sulla, said the tax court. Mr. Travis was indicted and went to prison for tax evasion following Mr. Sulla's recommendations. Mr. Sulla was disqualified in that case as well as in our case as being a necessary witness at trial, being involved as he had been. And then you have Mr. Sulla's non-appearance in court. It's very odd that the entire case of the United States versus Arthur Lee Ong, wherein the largest arms dealer in the state of Hawaii, both military and government weaponry included, was being sold by Mr. Ong. And Mr. Sulla came in and worked with America's leading tax evasion guru named Lamar Hardy to tell Mr. Ong how he should be laundering his money through a religious trust scheme. And so Mr. Ong was indicted, and Mr. Sulla was named in the superseding indictment on July 28, 2010. The superseding indictment states that the complicit parties in the conspiracy to defraud the government included PS, stood for Paul Sulla, and that was actually covered in the Star Advertiser in Honolulu on a featured article. Ultimately, Ong went to prison. All people went to prison except for Mr. Sulla, who was behind the entire tax evasion schemes, and he walked. He didn't even have to show up to be a witness at trial. Now, what does that tell you? Now, Mr. Sulla is also involved in the case of United States of America versus James Scott Sparkman, and that's a case where they stipulated a final judgment that James Sparkman's corporation had defrauded a lot of consumers, and Mr. Sulla, again, was largely behind the conviction of Mr. Sparkman, but apparently did not himself receive any slap on the wrist. Now, referring back to the case of Arthur Lee Ong, where Ong had developed, based on Sulla, a vertical abusive trust beneficiary scheme. That's a quote from tax prosecutors and tax investigators in how tax evasion is commonly conducted and administered, particularly by corrupt lawyers. In this case, Mr. Sulla created for Mr. Ong a vertical abusive trust beneficiary scheme involving Thunderbug Inc. and Magna Firearms that was doing business under the brand name of Magnum Firearms, and the governing company was Thunderbug Inc. And then there was Magnum Investments Trust with shill trustees, where Mr. Sulla set that up. And then they had two other entities involved in levels of protection from Mr. Ong himself, the Aloha Ventures entity and the Nahoa Enterprises, which was an offshore beneficiary. And that's how Arthur Lee Ong laundered his money. Now, in our case, this is how the same kind of vertical abusive trust beneficiary scheme was conducted by Mr. Sulla. You have Mr. Sulla in his vast real estate and drug trafficking enterprise has what's called Keomanu Limited Partnership and Keomanu Ventures. Two trusts, one is a partnership trust, the other is a revocable trust. And on another level, on a deeper level, you have Keomana Management Trust, which is a revocable UDT trust, and then two trustees that are completely fake, totally fiction. Harold T. White is supposedly a trustee that Mr. Sulla signs for, forges the name for his trust and his moving of his properties. And Robert L. Powers, which, as you'll see in a couple minutes, they made a mistake on one of their forgeries. They called him Powis instead of Powers. And so this, again, just goes to show you that the abusive trust beneficiary scheme is vertical, and that's how Mr. Sulla maintains an arm's length distance from the actual perpetrators of the crimes, and Mr. Sulla then escapes his convictions. In our case, again, with regard to the actual entity that Mr. Sulla set up for Mr. Hester, you can see that it is multi-level, and you have Sulla initially conspiring with Lee. This diagram actually shows how Mr. Sulla would position himself to flip the property to himself, all the while utilizing these fictions, these parties, these entities, from Mr. Hester to the churches. And here is the vertical abuse of trust beneficiary scheme laid out graphically, where in the upper left-hand image you see that he conspired with Lee. Mr. Sulla conspired with Lee to defraud me. That's the first level. That was committed May 15th to the 28th, 2009, while Lee was dying. And in fact, you'll see in a couple minutes, Mr. Lee wasn't even available to sign, apparently, these incorporations. On the second level, the GOB Church, the Gospel of Believers Church, sham church entity that they formed on the second level on the 28th, whereby it was too late. They had already fraudulently transferred the mortgage and the promissory notes to the church. It wasn't even in existence until the 28th of May 2009. And then below that, later, Mr. Hester became the shill beneficiary by a quitclaim deeding of the property on June 9th, 2011. At the same exact time, you can see the level below Mr. Hester there, lower left-hand side graphic. You can see same exact date. The partner to the quitclaim deed was the mortgage that Mr. Sulla gave to Mr. Hester, a so-called loan for $50,000 that was secured by the property illegally. And then other co-counsel representing Hester adds to the buffer and the protection and the concealment of the real party of interest, Mr. Sulla. As now you can see on the lower right-hand side, Mr. Hester pays no taxes, and then Mr. Sulla can foreclose based on his mortgage loan to Hester. This is another graphic of how it was that Mr. Sulla committed this crime utilizing these entities for his own concealment and the vertical abuse of trust beneficiary scheme. It's laid out the 28th of May 2009. They incorporated the church about 10 days after they made the fraudulent assignments that you can see in the middle of your screen is where Mr. Lee's dying. Then Mr. Sulla forms the church, then grants Mr. Hester the church on September 18th, substitutes him as plaintiff in our litigations to use the courts for extortion against us. And then Sulla auctions the property to Hester, as I mentioned, on April 20th, 2010. And then the transfers occur from there. The church pays $10 to itself, supposedly, to get the clear title to the property following Mr. Sulla's auction. And then later, when Mr. Sulla secures his own interest in the property by that $50,000 mortgage loan to Hester, he gives the transfer of the deed from the church over to Mr. Hester, which is also a violation of a number of laws. And here's the prima facie evidence of securities fraud and fraudulent transfers. These 9 documents prove irrefutably that Mr. Sulla has committed a series of issuing fraudulent securities, series of fraudulent transfers of those and other securities in order to ultimately position himself to take the property for himself. Here is the assignment of mortgage and notes that are extremely extraordinary. You can see on the upper left-hand side of the page itself, the image itself, Paul J. Sulla Jr. filed it. That's certified it to the Bureau of Conveyances. And it says assignment of mortgage, and it is fraudulently warranted. If you read the warranty, it says that nobody else holds an interest. Now, again, this was after we paid over $400,000 into this property, timely payments. We certainly held an interest, neglected that interest they did in the filing and certifying of this false record to the state. And you can also see that it says that nobody else has defaulted on this particular mortgage. Well, gee whiz, we had just spent 5 years in the Ibarra court where the plaintiff claimed that we had defaulted on the mortgage. So this is a completely fraudulent document on its face. But it gets worse than that. The organization that the mortgage is being transferred to is this one, incorporated, as I mentioned, on the 28th of May. And this is the Articles of Incorporation for the Gospel of Believers, so-called church, that's got a number of defects. Number one, it's got falsely addressed at 13811 Malama Street. That is not legally the property of Mr. Lee, not the property of Mr. Lee's domicile, not legally the address of the business office for the church. In fact, the owner of that property filed to the federal court that Mr. Lee was a guest there, had no legal presence there, and that the church never did one day of service there, and it was a complete fraud. It never existed, and the owners of the property, the Ritkes, had asked that Hester remove his name and his address from any of the illegal filings. Now, some of Lee's illegal signatures, his forged signatures, appear on this document. It has a certification of an evidence of appointment. Gwen Hillman, who is Mr. Lee's sister, was supposedly the one who was certifying that Mr. Lee was officially appointed as the overseer, virtually owner of this church. And that document is fraudulent on its face. Miss Gwen Hillman's signature is not on it. Mr. Lee's is. The same document is signed 20 days apart, May 8th and May 28th. Why would somebody who's signing a single document sign 2 or 3 different pages of it on 2 different dates, 20 days apart? Doesn't make any sense whatsoever, except you're dealing with a sloppy forgery and a sloppy fraud. And that's what Mr. Sulla does. He doesn't do things particularly neatly. He does things very quickly, and he makes a lot of mistakes, and that's why we as investigative journalists were able to gather all this intelligence on him and be able to expose him for the crimes that he's been committing. Now, if you open that document up on 2 different pages, you'll see this exact cut and paste copy job of Cecil Lauren Lee's supposed signatures. And if you look carefully at the squiggly lines upon which these signatures are made, well, there's something wrong with them. When you type on a computer, a word processor, or even on a typewriter, it looks a hell of a lot better than this. And this is just a slight indication that you're dealing with a forgery or a cut and paste job. But what's extremely striking is that no person signs their name twice exactly the same way as you see Mr. Lee purportedly did here. Now, supposedly, as I mentioned, this was signed by Lee on either the 8th of May, 2009, or the 28th of May, 2009. And at that time, according to Mr. Lee's death certificate, he was not in Hawaii. He was in Arizona. And so it makes most sense that Mr. Lee himself did not cut and paste. Why would Mr. Lee, if he was here, if he was signing this document, why would he forge his own signature? It doesn't make any sense. Somebody else created this document for Mr. Lee. The only person who stood to gain was Mr. Sulla at that time, not Mr. Hester. Mr. Hester is not bright enough to do this kind of fraud and scheming or type up these kinds of documents. Mr. Sulla apparently did this, and it fits Mr. Sulla's other forgeries, as I'm going to show you now. We have Mr. Sulla forging at least 6 other people's signatures. Now, this by Mr. Lee apparently is the 7th signature that we have forged by Mr. Sulla. On the left-hand side of your screen, you can see confirmed signatures of Cecil Lauren Lee, and if you look carefully, every single one of the first letters of each name, the pen picks up off the page. It stops, and then the rest of the name commences. Also, you can see that in the 2 L's for Lauren Lee, each L stops with a little hook to the left before the pen is picked up off the paper. Well, it doesn't do that in the other signatures that Mr. Sulla's provided and certified to the state here. As you can see in the right-hand section, 3 apparent forgeries are on the assignments of the mortgage and the assignments of the notes, and there's not even a lifting of the pen. The signature on the upper section of that right-hand side document doesn't look like Lauren Lee's signature whatsoever, and these are very, very poor forgeries. Now, in this next graphic, you could see that Paul J. Sulla III, whose correct signature on a receipt of his condominium, his transfer of the property that he resides in, apparently, has an accurate signature of his, whereas the ones from legal filings in our cases, Mr. Sulla Jr., the lawyer, forged his son's signatures. And you could say, oh, well, father-son thing, it's excusable, father has the authorization of the son. Well, unfortunately, that's not the case, because this is just the tip of the pattern that you're about to see. And some of these apparent forgeries and fraudulent transfers of properties, you can see are signed by a notary by the name of Carol L. Silva. And you can see that Ms. Silva here is considered the manager or signing for Mr. Sulla's organization, Keoimanu Ventures, LLC. Whereas above Ms. Silva's signature as manager, you can see written Hilo, the 27th day. Look at the H. The H is very much Sulla's H, as I'll show you in a minute. But Ms. Silva has consistently been a notary, along with Gloria Emery of Mr. Sulla's fraudulent transactions. Here you can see Miss Emery. You can see her signature notary on a Sulla document for Mr. Hester. And that you can see that Mr. Sulla actually has Miss Emery not just as a notary, but on his incorporation documents, she is an official of Paul J. Sulla Jr., attorney at law, a law corporation. And here is that interesting document that Mr. Robert L. Powers and Harold W. White, a lot of information can be gained from this single document. Again, this is the Keoimanu Limited Partnership that's related to Keoimanu Management Trust, where you just saw the notary was Carol L. Silva. And you see that Mr. Harold T. White, trustee of this particular trust, has the H very similar to the H in Hilo that you just saw a couple of images ago. Moreover, more importantly, you can take a look at the signature of Robert Powis, successor trustee, on the right-hand side, lower part of the page. And you can see that this was a clear mistake. In fact, they had attempted to deal with this signature a couple times. That's why it's so dark. On close examination, you can see that they wrote over the name Robert L. Powis, successor trustee, twice, and that the original Robert L. Powers is Powers, not Powis, and is written once. Now, what's interesting is that there is no Robert L. Powers existing on the Big Island of Hawaii except for one, over in Kona, who has nothing to do with this organization. Now, Mr. Harold T. White, likewise, has no footprint whatsoever in the Hawaiian community, nothing on the Big Island, and the only Harold T. White that we were able to find in the United States is the Harold T. White who died from eastern Massachusetts, which is where Mr. Sulla comes from. Now, take a careful look on this next graphic. You can see that Harold T. White is written twice in two different signatures on the legal filings of property transfers and or the partnership organizations and trusteeships that Mr. Sulla created. And you can see that in the lower portion of the screen is, again, Hilo, Hawaii. There's two H's, Hawaii, the H, the Hilo H. It looks a little bit like an A. There's an A within the H. Also, there's the August letter, the A, likewise, where the pen drops down, flips back up to the left, and then crosses over, which is a unique way to make an A, which you see is Mr. Sulla's way of signing and handwriting these documents, likewise seen with Mr. Harold White's particular signature. Now, here's another forgery by apparently Mr. Sulla. This is Sulla's partner, Greg Gadd. He's another real estate entrepreneur He may also be a real estate agent, but ultimately what you see in the higher portions of the page are Mr. Gadd's legitimate signatures. You can see that they are very pointed at the top. No discernible circular construction to these signatures of Mr. Gadd, who is a partner, a general partner in this Gadd Enterprises group. And that here you see in the lower portion of the screen, you can see the signatures don't look anything like the ones above them. And so we believe also this is significant evidence. Mr. Gadd, by the way, wrote a supportive letter to Mr. Sulla in one of our litigations, but really failed to go out of his way to say that he trusted Mr. Sulla himself, and Mr. Gadd gave him tentatively support. Now here is, on the next page, you can see the signature at the top of process server Robert Ducat from Pyramid Process Service. And you can see that, again, there's a very distinct type of signature of Mr. Ducat, and it doesn't do this big wavy stuff that we witness in Mr. Sulla's signature in the lower right side. And we had Beth Chrisman, who is a handwriting expert, analyze dozens of Sulla signatures and as many documents as we could get her on Mr. Ducat's signature to see if it was Mr. Ducat or Mr. Sulla that signed our dumb on the terrorizing ejectment complaint that Mr. Sulla placed on our gate, but Mr. Ducat actually gave an affidavit, a bad faith affidavit to the court that said that he had actually signed and delivered. Here is the actual signature of our dumb. And you can see that that sloppy, haphazard writing style, and this was on Philip Carey's stationery. And we have a couple different signatures of Carey that Mr. Sulla had apparently forged, but this one is the R. Dumb signature. R. Dumb. That's an ironic statement by Mr. Sulla. Now, the expert handwriting analysis and forensic document expert Beth Chrisman declared, quote, "There's a strong probability that Robert Ducat of the known signature samples did not sign the three question documents. It is probable that Paul Sulla of the known handwriting and signature samples wrote and signed the question documents." She said, to reiterate, if there were only two suspects or possible writers in this case, one being Robert Ducat and the other being Paul Sulla Jr., then it is more probable the author of the question documents is Paul Sulla Jr. Now take a look at the securities fraud and the fraudulent transfers and the assignments of the mortgage and the notes. It says that the assignment of the mortgage is made on the 15th day of May 2009 by Lauren Lee, and he states his address is 13-811 Malama Street, Pahoa, which is not his legal address. In fact, the legal owner of that address, Herbert M. Ritke, wrote to the federal court stating that, quote, Lauren Lee created a church in 2004 without his son, Ron Ritke, or his own, Herbert Ritke's, knowledge or consent. Years later, he misled Herbert Ritke into becoming an official. He said it was for a future church, not one he already created. He wrote that my son, Ron Ritke, was not even living at my house property in question in 2004. He goes on to say, yes, we both became aware of Lee's creating a church using our address, but again, doing so without our permission or knowledge. No business or church services were ever conducted on our property, and that is why we did not think the church had ever been created. So in a nutshell, here you have the forged signatures on Lee's assignments of the mortgage and the notes. Additional defects include false address at 13811 Malama Street, signed contemporaneously with the appeal concerning the $200,000 jury award to yours truly. In other words, this was an evasion of 5 judgment creditors at this point. False warranty stated on the assignment of the mortgage. It stated that there had been no defaults, when in fact Lee had been litigating, arguing that there was defaults, and that false warranty stated that the debt was due and owing when in fact it had already been paid and the notes and the mortgage were void. The assignments were made by Sulla, forging Lee's signature 13 days before the sham church legally came into existence. And this is a classic fraudulent transfer. The note had been paid in full at the time. The assigner evaded releasing the mortgage as required. There were multiple parties with court-ruled interests in the mortgage and the note. And here you can see from the court record itself that on May the 21st was when Mr. Sulla filed the appeal and the appeal docketing statement to contest the $200,000 jury award, which was in place at this particular moment in time. And you can see that he had filed additional filings in the court to reverse that jury award. So clearly this was the matter. There was $200,000 that were being contested at that time, that Mr. Lee was a judgment debtor of 5 judgment creditors for approximately $435,000 at that time, debting from 3 different cases. And that here you can see also from the court record that on or about August the 31st, there was a substitution of the plaintiff by Mr. Sulla. Mr. Lee was substituted then by the church, the fraudulent church. So in essence, there's evidence now, solid evidence, in fact, rock-solid evidence that Mr. Sulla defrauded the court as well as yours truly. And here's the law that Mr. Sulla broke, Hawaii Revised Statute 485A, Section 508, dealing with criminal penalties. And you can see for a property that he intended to steal, valued beyond $100,000, it's a Class A felony. What's interesting is just a few days ago, a very similar case was completed after 20 years of being in litigation. And it's a precedent-setting case of the Kokonas versus Dr. Michael Borneman, who had fraudulently transferred the deeds entitled to properties that he should not have. Very, very similar fraudulent transfer act violating HRS 651C, and that the court just came in and literally slam dunked Dr. Borneman. They awarded the Kokonas over $1.6 million and additional damages because of the fraud. Now in this chart you can actually see the badges of fraudulent transfers, and you can see all the check marks here for all of the 6 securities transferred illegally, and you can see all of the different characteristics of a fraudulent transfer called the badges of fraudulent transfer, showing you that we have a classic case here of a pattern of fraudulently transferring securities. Now, most shocking to me was what Ms. Kane discovered not that long ago, was that Mr. Sulla committed all of these acts, the non-judicial foreclosure sale included, on April 20th, 2010, with no judicial authorization whatsoever, no standing to do any of this, in violation of HRS Section 531-285, which requires a court to provide for the sale of interstate property, which he never got. In fact, he filed the paperwork in March of 2012, nearly 2 years too late. Mr. Sulla filed a request for court authorization for Hester to become a personal representative of Lee's estate, in gross violation of the other laws, a probate court as well as interstate laws for personal representation of the deceased. And in the process of doing all this, Mr. Sulla also violated a number of consumer debt collection practices laws and also unfair and deceptive trade laws. And really what this is about is Mr. Sulla's attempt to steal our uniquely geothermal and therapeutic property to compete unfairly in the natural health products and services industry that attracts tourists from the mainland right to this area of Hawaii, especially the Big Island. Visitors come, especially to the eastern part of the Big Island, for these kinds of retreats, and we have Hawaii's only lava-heated steam saunas and adjacent geothermally warm bathing pools. So this is the property that interests Mr. Sulla greatly. And through this racketeering enterprise that Mr. Sulla has incorporated as a corporation sold with the state of Hawaii, that is the Eclectic Center of Universal Flowing Light, Paulo Roberto Silva. Notice Roberto and Silva are placed together in one name. That's not the case. The church internationally has the separation. Mr. Sulla has done this to conceal his own organization and separate it from the legitimate Church of Ayahuasca, which is in South America. But here you see that the purpose of this entity is for the administration and management of the affairs and the properties and the temporalities of the church in the district of Hawaii, that is the county of Hawaii. And here you can see wherein Mr. Sulla's interests lie in unfair competition to yours truly and our companies, dealing with health products and health services and seminars and utilizing this magnificent property for these purposes. You can see his unfair competition deals with the Health Connection, Inc. These are corporations and entities that Mr. Sulla has formed over the past several years. He has the Health for Wealth organization. These companies are no longer operating, but they certainly were at one time. It shows you his interest. He has the Friends of the Amazon Forest. You can see his name on as an official officer therein. And you can also see the Santa Deme Communities Healing System that his son currently, Joseph Sulla III, is promoting currently on the internet. So you can see that the type of industry and business that we're engaged in, the commercial operations of our property, is exactly what Mr. Sulla would like to have of his own and to call his own, and thereby bring our property, as he has done, into his racketeering enterprise. Now here's where it begins to be a big risk to the community in the administration of his drug trafficking operation. You can begin to see, if you read the media, that this ayahuasca brewing and creating and trafficking and then basically not telling people what the potential risks are, not getting informed consent, is extremely risky. People have died from this. And in fact, on the lower left side of your screen is Dr. Stanley Krippner, who made this whole field pretty famous. Next to him is Dr. Stefan Kessian, who attended the Sulla's church with Dr. Krippner and wrote about it on the internet, wrote about how he took the ayahuasca and fell flat on his face. Nobody was there to catch him. His eyeglasses pierced his skull. He had braces on at the time that pierced his lips. He came to, he was hemorrhaging, very freaked out, of course, as anyone would be, and nobody there wanted to take him to the hospital. He had to plead with them and argue with them to get them to take him to emergency care here in Hilo, apparently, or in Waimea, and that's where he had a couple dozen sutures he wrote, and it was very interesting for him, his perspective, looking at this as a spiritual awakening experience. There have been a number of doctorate dissertations presented, including this one from Christine L. Holman, with regard to the risks to society and even traditional native cultures who have been engaged in the Santa Dome practices, the rituals. Well, it may do very well in the hands of a traditional shaman down in South America, but when you read and you interview those shaman about what it is that they see as going wrong with this whole religious hype concerning ayahuasca and ayahuasca tourism, you come to a completely different picture on this that is growing like wildfire across America and elsewhere. For example, it states here in the interview with an indigenous shaman, Roger Rumrill, it provides an account of the rise in ayahuasca tourism in the Amazon, and as a shaman, he expresses his concern over the proliferation of these, quote, false shamans, such as Mr. Sulla III, as well as Sulla Jr. The shaman believes that, quote, the phenomenon of drug tourism is opportunistic and based on an insincere core of individuals anxious to gain economic benefit from borrowed mysticisms. Lolo reflects his concern and explains that because there is no control, there has been more commercialization of ayahuasca. He asserted that this lack of regulation can have a very strong effect and argued that if we do not stop it now, in the future it will be a killer. When asked why, Lalo replied, everyone will want to be on that plan, making money only with ayahuasca. It will be like a mine. So now you can see what Mr. Sulla intends in his orientation towards getting money as much as possible and in many ways as possible, particularly in the area of health and tourism, health tourism to Hawaii. And here you can see now a picture, several images of the estate that he has attempted to steal. This is our estate. This is the Creator's Rainbow Spa in the Hawaiian Holy Land we lovingly call Sedona, Hawaii, because of the red rocks and the orange rocks, how beautiful it is. What you're witnessing right there on the screen is what my hands created. I worked on this landscaping for about 2 years to create it to be the way it is, and there was nothing like this before in the image we showed you previously. That this is a magnificent property, and Mr. Sulla has attempted to and done a pretty good job, got very close to now stealing it. $1 million property for $10 and other valuable consideration. And if you don't think that this is enough evidence to indict Mr. Sulla on the very strong antitrust violations that he has committed, then all you need to do is take a look at this operation about a mile down the road from us that Mr. Sulla acquired and incorporated the Articles of Incorporation for the Hawaiian Sanctuary, currently owned by Mr. Steve Lund, who purchased this property from Mr. Sulla. And in the process, when I first met Mr. Lund and talked to him about what he had planned, he told me some very nasty things about Mr. Sulla, how Mr. Sulla had ripped him off also. In fact, initially he told me that Mr. Sulla ripped him off for about $20,000. And then the next time I asked him about it, he says, well, it wasn't that much. It was only about $10,000. But at any rate, Mr. Sulla is a virtual partner with Mr. Lund in an operation that's a stone's throw away, really, from the property that I just showed you. And again, when you piece all the pieces together and realize what he's doing, not only fraudulently transferring securities to acquire this property, and then you see the businesses that he's in, it is a clear antitrust violation that this man has been committing. Now, we have a list of counterclaims that's too long for this presentation today, but here is a picture of the 18 of them that we probably could add a few more as well, including treason and seditious conspiracy to bring a new religion that's a cult, a menacing cult, to America. We had filed that in the federal court case, and I think it's quite viable. I think it's also outrageous at this point in time that the Office of Disciplinary Counsel and the Supreme Court of Hawaii have not already acted to delicense Mr. Sulla after what he's been doing. Here you have from the Rules of Professional Conduct in the preamble, a lawyer who commits fraud in the conduct of a business is subject to discipline for engaging in conduct involving dishonesty, fraud, deceit, misrepresentations, and certainly Mr. Sulla has done that, and the Supreme Court of Hawaii has been noticed a number of times. The Office of Disciplinary Counsel knows and has been noticed a couple times, in fact, that he's a repeat offender in this area, yet they have not disciplined him. Why would that be? Good question. Also, professional conduct rule violation. Lawyers' conduct should conform to the requirements of law, both in professional service to clients and in the lawyer's business and personal affairs. A lawyer should use the law's procedures only for legitimate purposes and not for harassment or intimidation of others. In our case, he's been using the courts for malicious prosecution, defamation, all sorts of commercial crimes in order to steal our property. Well, that's about it. That's the end of this presentation. I just want to end with this little quote from Thomas Jefferson in support of a free press and human rights. Thomas Jefferson said in support of the First Amendment to the United States Constitution, quote, "If it were left to me to decide whether we should have a government without newspapers or newspapers without a government, I should not hesitate a moment to prefer the latter." And Abraham Lincoln said, "Let the people know the facts, and the country will be safe." I'm Dr. Leonard Horowitz, telling you the facts about attorney Paul J. Sulla Jr. Bye for now.